particularly as many had become persons of substance in Bahamian society. To address this concern of the white biopowered plantation society, which was manifested in the Bahamian legislation, legislation was enacted in 1756 to ascertain who shall not be mulattoes. The intent of this somewhat innovative legislation was to limit upward mobility and reinforce white dominance by mandating that only whites could be fully free, and that by implication a strict biological description as opposed to economic status would define who was white. However, the universality of race mixing over the millennia in the Americas and the Caribbean, including the Bahamas, ensured that the race legislation had to operate on a fiction of white identity by providing that all persons who were more than 3 degrees removed in a lineal descent from a Negro ancestor exclusive would be deemed to be white and imbued with all the privileges and immunity of His Majesty's white subjects of these islands, provided they were free and brought up in the Christian religion. Maurice Bishop, in opening remarks to the 1979 National Education Conference in Grenada, stated that the worst crime which being committed by colonialism has been the education system, and the way that the system was developed and used ensured that the colonized abandoned their own history, culture, and values, and accepted the principles of white superiority. The underlying ethos behind this phenomenon is explained by Cabral, when he points out that the ideal for foreign domination, whether imperialist or not, would be choose whether to liquidate all of the population of the dominated territory, thereby eliminating all opportunities for cultural resistance, or to succeed in imposing itself without change to the culture of the colonized people by harmonizing economic and political domination of these people with their cultural personality. He indicates that the first hypothesis implies genocide on an indigenous population and creates a void which empties foreign domination of its content. Cabral indicates that his first hypothesis for colonial domination has not been confirmed by history, having no practical viability. This was the case in the Bahamas, where depopulation and genocide of the indigenous Tainos by the Spanish ensured that the Bahamas remained sparsely or largely unpopulated for several centuries. However, Cabral posits that in order to escape this choice, which may be called the dilemma of cultural resistance, imperialist colonial dominationists tried to create theories which are in effect only gross formulations of racism. In this regard, Bishop asserts that colonial education systems were used in this way to create a number of illusions and deep-seated fallacies which were designed to teach the colonized to accept attitudes of authoritarian rule and hierarchical structure. Excuse me. Again, a little older. Gotta take a little sip of water. In the old days, it might have been something else back in 1851. I saw some of those bottles there. But in this regard, it's important to consider the contention that in discussing colonialism, the issue of former political control is by no means the only one to consider, and that informal coalitions such as multinational firms can and do exercise authority over foreign national areas, being engaged in colonial relations of some type or the other. Given the essentiality of block and class democracy, we're forced to conclude that despite significant advancement of black descendants of African slaves in the Bahamas since the era of slavery in the 19th century, and the attainment of universal adult suffrage and majority rule in 1967, their enmeshment in this neo-colonial phenomenon has impeded the quest for genuine self-identity. Rather, it's created a false facade of identity, totally divorced from the historical realities of ordinary everyday Bahamians. This multinational corporate nationalism, neo-colonialism in the Bahamas is driven by an economic model of offshore banks, casinos, hotels, and other financial and touristic enterprises. It's created a 21st plantation system in which labor of many ordinary black Bahamians drives the plantation economy owned by white expatriate corporate interests. This model of development, a collaborative design of Stafford Sands and Wallace Groves, was embraced by the majority-rule Progressive Liberal Party government in 1967 and by successive administrations since the attainment of nominal independence in 1973. This is indicated in Prime Minister's Independence Assurance in an address to 100 international bankers at an annual banquet of Deltec Pan American SA in 1967, shortly after assuming power, when he pledged without qualification not to impose corporate or personal income taxes, to honor the financial commitments of the previous United Bahamian Party UBP government, and to continue all projects of major importance, thereby signifying that it was to be business as usual. He indicated that for all those investors who wish to come to these shores to create new jobs, new functions, new wealth for this colony, notice jobs. I want to assure you that it's the desire of my government to greet you with open arms for all who wish to help. I want to assure you here tonight that prudence will be my government's watchword in dealing with the economic policies of the Bahamas. We fervently ask the investment community, so ably represented here tonight by the Deltec Group, to march, he got good things with these phrases, you know, into this bright tomorrow, hand in hand with the government. The economic policy of successive Bahamian governments has been driven by this vision, which was crystallized in a speech by Pindling to the 20th General Convention of the PLP in 1975, when he stated that the Bahamian economy was one that was relatively sophisticated but fragile, unable to withstand radical policy initiatives in foreign policy, which aimed to change traditional relationships. He indicated that even though to continue the structure as presently constituted would mean the attraction of massive amounts of foreign capital with a consequent increase in foreign ownership, it would ensure loss of independent economic action, with any changes meaning a slower pace of development and a lower standard of living. In such a context, it's important to bear in mind the assertion that corporate crime is rendered invisible by its complex and sophisticated planning and execution, by non-existent or weak law enforcement and prosecution, and by lenient legal and social sanctions which fail to reaffirm or reinforce collective sentiments on moral boundaries. This brings to mind Emile Durkheim's assertion that the most blameworthy acts are so often absolved by the boundary between what is permitted and what is prohibited, what is just and what is unjust, which has nothing fixed about it, but is seemingly susceptible to almost arbitrary change by individuals. This has ensured that in a Bahamian frame of reference, the concept of identity is manifest as the ambivalent self, an identity balanced on wheels of inequality, uncertainty, disenfranchisement, difference, and lack of empowerment. Indeed, this ambivalent self characterizes a postmodern Bahamian and widened Caribbean crisis of identity, which for African descendants has been molded and fashioned in the shape and form of former slave and colonial masters, who have themselves emerged into postmodern society with an overwhelming crisis of national identity. This is being indicated profoundly by Eric and Mary Josephson when they state that one of the most disturbing phenomena of Western culture has been man's sense of estrangement from the world he himself has made or inherited, which is in essence man's alienation from himself and others. They say that the ties that formerly bound Western man to himself and the world about him have snapped, leading to modern Western man rapidly becoming detached from nature, from their old gods, from the technology that transforms his environment and now threatens to destroy it, from his work and its products, and from his leisure, from the complex social institutions that presumably serve but are more likely to manipulate him, from the community in which he lives, and above all, from his body and his sex, from his feelings of love and tenderness, and from his art, his creative and productive potential. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing points out that the myriad aspects of this alienation dynamic, which on the surface appear unconnected, are recognized as highly interrelated and tied to a central core. She contends that anxiety and narcissism are tied to that